Thanksgiving is a holiday synonymous with thankfulness, gratefulness, appreciation, whatever you want to call it. Thanksgiving comes down to a time of reflectance. And for this episode, I wanted to reflect on the lives of the animals living inside the 125-gallon Australian Vivarium. That's the White's tree frogs and the green and golden bell frogs. These groups of frogs have had to call this place home for over 2 years. They've had to live with all of the plants filling in however they would. Nothing would come in to disturb them. I rarely even cut them back. So the frogs had the opportunity to live out their lives in this enclosure almost as if it was a miniature forest. But don't worry, nobody's dying and there's no tragic stories for the most part with this episode. The only thing I'm going to talk about is how things have changed for these frogs. They are going from a 125-gallon and moving ship. They're actually going into a much larger enclosure. But before we talk about that at the end of this episode, I wanted to showcase some of the highlights and showcase some of the unique shots I was able to capture of the bell frogs and the White's tree frogs, and talk about them as we have the opportunity to showcase who's moving in to the next enclosure. Who you're looking at here is Atlas, the first bell frog that I laid my eyes on at Josh's Frogs, July 23rd, 2022. That's right, on my birthday, these were the frogs that I was able to pick up. Sadly, nobody wanted these frogs, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity. It was one of those bucket list things for me. And if you've watched my YouTube channel, there's not many frogs or pets that I consider a bucket list species, but the bell frogs were one of them. I wanted somebody to accompany the White's tree frogs. You're looking at Max, the dominant female White's tree frog, who I've had for over 10 years. It's safe to say, Max was my very first frog that I took seriously as an adult. I got her all the way back when I was a senior in high school, and now I've just finished graduating with my master's in biology. It's unbelievable that Max has seen me going through all of the highs and lows, and she's been with me through it all. I can't wait to move Max into the upcoming enclosure, and just to reflect on her, how stable and how consistent she's been over the years. She's gotten some dark age spots. As I'm told by vets and other herpetologists, it's nothing to worry about, but I still look at it and ponder on it all the time. Another thing we have to talk about with Max, everybody probably thinks, wow, she's probably overweight. However, I had her examined by a vet in the summer, and he said Max has a rare condition where she stores air in these pockets inside of her body. So actually, we don't really know what her true weight is because it's hard to get her to release that air. But the only thing we can confirm now is that Max is healthy, she's been dewormed, she continues to get examined by vets so that way we know that she's in the best shape possible. Whether it's x-rays, ultrasounds, blood work, or fecal samples, Max is going to be taken care of. Now, there's an Easter egg that we've been hiding for a few years, even though she's been on the channel over the years. That's right, the lizard to the left of my bell frog Atlas. You're looking at Amzie, the female southeastern five-line skink, who was a part of the old alias, the five-line dumpy family, which also included Max, Spurgeon, Jeremiah, and her former mate, Pharaoh, who I miss dearly. After his passing, there has been so many years that have gone by since Amzie has been showcased or even highlighted in a video. It wasn't intentional to keep her quiet, but there was many months where I would not see her inside the enclosure, often wondering what became of her. But every so often, she would always make an appearance, and I was able to catch her and move her into the new enclosure along with the bell frogs and with the White's tree frogs. I'm optimistic that I'll have the opportunity to capture the bell frogs and Amzie out in the open, kind of like what I am for this episode, but these shots are far and few in between over the months and even years of owning these animals. They're very nervous and cautious critters. They're not one of the frogs like Max or even my toads or gray tree frogs, where they're going to sit out in the open and wait for me to come feed them or even to interact with them. They want to be left alone. They only let you see them when they want to. They're a lot like cats in that perspective. Sadly, this episode is not without its tragedy though. I do have to report that some tragedy struck in the late summer to early fall for the Australian frogs in this ecosystem. Sadly, Spurgeon, the male White's tree frog, who was one of the more common frogs I would film when making these episodes, developed a situation where he was filling up with fluid, and sadly, that was his demise. I'm not exactly sure what took place because he saw multiple vets and there was a lot of time put into trying to care for him. I think Spurgeon is one of the main reasons why I wanted to make a Thanksgiving video about the Australian tree frogs, because if it wasn't for him, I don't think I would have as much appreciation or gratefulness as I celebrate here the upcoming enclosure for all of these frogs and toads. It also comes with sacrifice and some tragedy. It's very disappointing to report on this little frog who's been with us for many years, and his demise has also led to even more effort and concentration being focused on all of these Australian frogs. And while sometimes on the channel, because there's fewer videos about them, it might seem like they're secondary, I can assure you all three enclosures are treated equally. Everybody's given the same love, affection, and care, and Max is my first frog. With her being in this enclosure, it meant that we had to step it up and make sure that this didn't happen again. As you can see, we have Jeremiah, the other male White's tree frog. I wanted to weigh him and make sure he was okay, and also check in on the other frogs and toads and Amzie to make sure that we had everybody else going in the right direction. I wanted to give a huge shout out to Spurgeon and thank him for everything, all of the memories over the years, as we celebrate the lives of these animals and this ecosystem. As we move it into a new enclosure, I didn't want to forget about one of the founding pieces and one of the staples when we think about this enclosure. White's tree frogs are the entire reason why this enclosure is here. If it wasn't for Max, we wouldn't have an Australian vivarium, and we wouldn't have a dumpy family, a 5-line skink group, or even the bell frogs. So I took it very seriously when that happened to Spurgeon. We are not going to replace Spurgeon in this ecosystem. We are only going to have 2 White's tree frogs, 3 bell frogs, and 1 skink. As we move forward, I'm optimistic that all of these little critters are going to thrive moving into a newer enclosure. There's a lot of questions as to whether or not the environment itself was at play for what happened to Spurgeon, and it led to some concern. For instance, it's very hard to get airflow into this enclosure, with it being an aquarium with plexiglass lids that have holes drilled inside. It retains humidity significantly compared to the other enclosures. That was one of the major concerns moving into this ecosystem. With the new environment that we have, it's a terrarium with a lot more airflow, and tree frogs and lizards both require a lot more airflow than what was going into this ecosystem. So thankfully, the new enclosure was designed and picked out by me specifically for tree frogs. The hope is Jeremiah, Atlas, and all of the White's tree frogs and bell frogs are a lot more active and more comfortable with better airflow in the future enclosure. I also changed up the background. There's a lot of opportunities for all of the frogs and lizards to hide underneath or behind this background, and it would be impossible to know where they're at or what they're doing. Instead, I went with pictures, and I've built up the vegetation. So what you're seeing with all of the expanding foam and the coconut husk, that's gone for the new enclosure. We're going to prioritize keeping everything in front of us, rather than allowing things to hide and potentially get misplaced. Another thing was that crickets were able to escape the sight of the frogs, and I had to spend a fortune just to feed this enclosure, With 7 mouths to feed and you're unsure who's eating, it leads to a lot more anxiety and frustration. So now, crickets can't hide in the background or dig deep into the soil without the frogs finding them. Thankfully, Amzie does dig into the soil, so there's no hiding from her either. But this enclosure gave us a lot of memories. As we miss Spurgeon and even Pharaoh from beforehand, we have to pay our respect and tribute to them, but we have to also be optimistic and look ahead to the bright future for all of these frogs and lizards. I can't wait to showcase them in future episodes as a staple for this season in the Wild Vivarium show. You're going to see a lot more of Atlas, Claris, Jeremiah, and Max, and maybe even Amzie if we're lucky. But I'll leave you to look on with some of the best scenes we've captured over the years. So take a look at this and get ready for a lot more Australian Vivarium episodes coming in the future. Happy Thanksgiving, and special shout out and salute to all of my Australian frogs. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more Wild Vivariums content. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks.
Enclosure.